So the next paper, we have Simon Glossner from the Federal Reserve Board. Thank you.
Okay, the mic is working? Perfect, thanks. Yeah, I would like to welcome everybody to my today's talk. Also the online audience, thanks for listening in. The paper has a broad title, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It's joint work with Alex Edmans and Caroline Flammer. Where's the clicker? It's here. And the usual disclaimer applies. This is like my own thoughts and not the Fed's thoughts. Let's jump straight in. So diversity, equity, and inclusion has become a first-order topic for citizens, for corporations, for investors. It's everybody knows the topic by now. And usually when people talk about DEI, they have two motivations in mind. The first is the social motivation. It's like that corporations, they have to contribute to the societal goals. It's about making a workforce that is more diverse, right? More equitable workforce or a more inclusive workforce. That's the social motivation of DEI. And then you sometimes see in the press or like people mention it, that there's also a financial motivation to DEI. And the financial motivation is that if you're a company that considers more diverse viewpoints, when you consider you are more equitable, you're more inclusive to different views of underrepresented groups or also of all your employees, then you might be more profitable because you're, for example, more innovative, more creative. So you have the social and the financial motivation. Now, under both motivations, we think that the relevant measure is more holistic, right? Diversity is a broad topic, and I will talk more about what we define, like how we define this. But also equity and inclusion, these are difficult to grasp. But then when we look at the data, and also when we see what the current debate is about, it's mostly about demographic diversity, in particular gender and race. That's, of course, you could say that's fine, and it's just all what we need. But what we thought is that maybe it would be interesting to look in particular at the financial motivation and to look more a bit more in a holistic way of measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion, and going a bit beyond demographic diversity. Let's jump straight into the claimed evidence. So we see a lot of evidence on DEI. McKinsey is quite famous for their study. They argue that demographic diversity increases the profit, or there's a correlation. But then when you look at the evidence, there is an academic paper that shows that the correlations are actually not robust. Then you have the Financial Reporting Council, which argues that if there are more women on the board, then the company performs better. But when you actually look at the study, you see none of their regressions are significant. And then there are sometimes the press mentions some studies, but in this particular case, we weren't actually able to find the study, so maybe it doesn't even exist. So we are academics, so maybe we look more at the academic evidence. There are some studies, and we have some people from these studies here in the audience. Most of the evidence focuses around the California and the Norway quota on the boardroom diversity. That's the more top published papers. And the Fried in 2021 summarized this as the empirical evidence provides little support for the claim that gender or ethnic diversity in the boardroom increases shareholder value. Of course, this doesn't mean we should stop doing demographic diversity now. It just means maybe it's better to motivate it from a social way than from a financial reason. Now, what do we mean by DEI? Why are we writing this paper, and why do we have this broad title? So diversity means to us you consider the perspectives and backgrounds of different criteria, and it of course includes gender and race, but it's also age, disability, experience, political, religion, and you could think of a broad list of criteria. That's the diversity part, but then we have equity and inclusion. And equity means providing equal opportunity rewards to all employees, regardless of their background. And we have inclusion, which is that employees of all backgrounds are made to feel welcomed. They are included in the firm. They are heard, right? It doesn't make sense to have minorities in the workforce if we then do not listen to them. That's the inclusive part that we have. So what are we doing in the paper? In the paper, we take a different approach than looking at gender and race criteria among the workforce. We look at the Great Place to Work data, and in case you're not familiar with the Great Place to Work, they run the best companies to work for, and Alex Edmans has a few papers on the best companies to work for. And what they do is they survey the employees of companies that apply to be a best company to work for. And they sent a survey to randomly selected employees. And we take the individual responses to the survey and particularly look at the DEI questions of this survey. So we take a subset of the full survey, and that's then our DEI measure. So you could think of this measure as some kind of like a grassroots indicator, or like employee perceptions, right? It's like what the employees themselves think about the company's DEI practices. Yeah, and it's usually there are 250 employees, and then like over the years, and they surveyed more employees per company. So you have like not just a few employees in this like they are surveyed, but you have a lot of, and you get some kind of like the employees, like a crowd opinion of the company DEI practices. And then we look at two research questions: what are the determinants of DEI, and what are the effects? And we put these in quotation marks because we are not really studying causal evidence here. This is like the first attempt of measuring DEI in a different way from demographic diversity. So we look at correlations, but I will talk more about this. Just to give you an overview of what you will hear in this talk, is the measure that we have, it is almost not correlated with demographic diversity. There is one exception, and that is the percentage of senior female managers. There we see a correlation. We have data between 2006 and 2021, about 2,000 firm year observations. When we look at the determinants of DEI, we find that DEI is stronger among financially strong firms and also among smaller growth firms. That's, I mean, probably what you would expect, given that in growth firms the employees probably matter more. And then finally, we look at like what are companies that we identify as having good DEI practices in the perception of the employees. What do we find when we look at future performance, right? And we see better accounting performance for these firms. We see that these firms are also valued higher by the stock markets. The current firm valuation is higher. Nevertheless, we see some earnings surprises, so it might not, like the better performance might not be fully captured by the stock market. When we look at innovation, the picture is a bit more mixed. We find some results when we look at the DEI responses by professionals. So we do not look at all employees that get surveyed in a company, we just look at the professionals. And there we find better, superior future patterns and also citations. And then finally, we look at stock returns, but we do not find evidence on stock returns, so there is no positive or negative alpha. And of course, the contribution then is, this is like the first paper to like measure DEI and like provide maybe a more holistic measure. And we provide first evidence, non-causal evidence, I want to say, about the determinants and effects of DEI. I'm doing on time? Perfect, yeah. Okay, so the determinants. The Great Place to Work Institute, they sent a survey to firms that apply to become a best company to work for. And then they randomly select 250 to like up to 3,000 in later years of the sample. They select the employees, and then they send a survey to these to the company. And the survey includes about 60 questions of all different kinds. And what we do is we picked 13 questions that we think are most related to DEI. And how we selected these questions are we started from the DEI definition that you saw earlier. Then we, independently of the three co-authors, we picked the DEI questions that we thought are more like relevant in terms of the definition. And then we reached a consensus. There was little disagreement. And then finally, we create the DEI measure and we aggregate it up over all the employees of a firm in a given year. And then we get a sample, a panel sample, for 2006 to 2021 of about 2,000 firm year observations. Now, these are the 13 questions that we selected from the survey. And I want to start in the middle here. You see people here are treated fairly regardless of their age, race, sex, sexual orientation. This is probably the most conventional diversity questions you might think of. But then we have other questions such as, for example, everyone has an opportunity to get special recognition, which could be like equity and inclusion. Or you have, whenever you join the company, you are made to feel welcome. That's also inclusion in our view. And then we have a bunch of other questions such as managers avoid playing favorites. That's, of course, some equity. And I can be myself around here is also equity and maybe even inclusion. So we have these are the 13 questions that made it into our measure. And then we take the average of these 13 questions, like the responses to these 13 questions, and we come up with a new measure. Now you might wonder, okay, we have a new measure, is it correlated with demographic diversity? Are we measuring the same, or are we measuring something different? So on this table here, you see female and minority percentage in the workforce. You see if the CEO is a female or a minority. We also have data on directors of the board. But the correlations are very low, and the highest actually is 0.17 with the percentage of women in senior management, whereas all the other demographics show very low correlations. Here we look at so on the left-hand side of this regression, we have DEI, and on the right-hand side we have lagged variables because we're interested in the determinants here. So we look at do companies better if they are financially stronger? And we find this to be the case. So we find a positive correlation between lagged 1 and 3 year past sales growth and also 3 years stock returns. So we do not think if a company doesn't have so much money that they cannot afford doing DEI, but we probably think of what could make sense is if you're a financially strong company, you might be more motivated to go for the long term, right? To be not short-term constrained. And then you might be more willing to improve DEI practices in your company. We also find that small and growth companies are more likely to have better DEI scores. And we find that financial constraints matter, in particular leverage and dividend yield. But here again, the evidence is the result is probably more indirect. It's not that these firms cannot afford it. Here we look at the demographic diversity again, and we see the result that I mentioned earlier already on the percentage of female senior managers. It's positively correlated to DEI. When we look at the CEO gender and race, or when we look at the directors gender or race, we do not find a positive correlation. We find an insignificant or sometimes even a negative correlation. And then interestingly, some companies have a DEI senior manager. They're called chief diversity officer. There's also no correlation. But this, of course, could be maybe a firm who is doing poorly in terms of DEI hires such a manager to improve DEI practice in the company. So then we would see exactly this result. When we look at so we also study workplace policies, like if the company has a flexible work schedule, if they have on-site childcare, if there is parental leave, if it's possible to do that. We do not find that any of these variables are significant. So just like having some workplace policies seem not to, at least these companies that have better DEI scores do not have this practice or do not, there's no correlation. Whereas for the unionized worker, we actually find a negative correlation. So this will giving you a flavor of the data that we have and also of the determinants. But now I want to jump in more in the effects of DEI. So what we're doing now is we have DEI on the right-hand side as a lagged variable. On the left-hand side, we are studying future performance. And here we study accounting performance. We have 8 different measures, such as return on assets, return on equity. And we find that DEI is positively correlated with 7 of the 8 accounting variables. And the effect is a 1 standard deviation increase in lagged DEI is associated with a 0.7 percentage point increase in return on assets. And what is interesting about this regression is that we also have the percentage of female and minorities in the workforce. Like we basically like included also demographic diversity in here, and we do not see a significant effect for demographic diversity. So what it matters for a company is like more. It seems to be more like you need to like improve diversity, equity, and inclusion, but not just like ticking a box and saying you're done. Thank you. You're done with DEI practices. An interesting result is we find that the DEI association with accounting performance is stronger among high-skilled industries, and Daniel has a nice theory paper on subtle discrimination, and we think this like corresponds well to his theory predictions. On the firm valuation, we see, so here we study current firm valuation, so we have on the left-hand side, we have firm valued measure. On the right, we have DEI. We see a positive correlation for all three. So the market seems to understand that these companies doing better. Might not be because of DEI, might be because these companies are better also in other ways, right? I mean, it could be an omitted variable bias here. But when we look at earnings surprises by sell-side analysts, we still see positive earnings surprises in the 1 year and also on the 2 year. So it seems that these companies, they perform better on the accounting performance. The market understands it to some extent. That's why these companies are valued higher. But still, we find some evidence for positive earnings surprises, which might indicate that maybe the market incorporates the positive effects only partially. Here we study innovation. For innovation, the picture is more mixed. We do not, like when we look at the baseline effect of DEI, we do not find a positive correlation. However, when we look at the DEI responses by professionals, so what we did is we looked only, like we broke down the baseline measure based on who responded to the survey, and we picked only the DEI professionals among all surveyed employees in a company. We find a positive correlation in patterns and citations. And we think this makes sense because the professionals include the R&D staff, right? Whereas for the others, it might be less important. And then finally, we look at stock returns, but we do not find evidence on a positive or a negative alpha. You could think like maybe because the market, like there are earnings surprises and positive accounting performance, you could think maybe the market doesn't fully incorporate this in the stock market. We do not find evidence for this. But of course, we have only 190 months, so like might be just too much noise in the short sample that we have to run asset pricing tests. To conclude, we study like a measure, or we provide a new measure of DEI based on the employee perceptions, based on a survey measure. And this measure shows no or very little correlation with demographic diversity. The one exception is the percentage of female senior managers in a company. We have a large panel from 2006 to 2021. And we take a first approach in studying like determinants and effects of DEI. And we find that DEI is stronger in financially strong firms and also in small growth firms. When we look at the future performance, we find a better accounting performance, better firm value, and also earnings surprises. For innovation, the evidence is a bit more mixed, and we find no stock returns, and the contribution is the new measure. So I very much look forward to the discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We have Geoffrey Tate from University of Maryland.
There's no pointer on this, or no? All right, so thanks a lot for inviting me here to discuss this paper. I think I learned last night that there are even other people in the audience who have discussed this paper, so I feel, I probably have very little to add that is going to be useful, but I'll try. So, all right, so Simon actually did a great job of leading us through what's in the paper, all the results, so I can go pretty quickly through this. The basic research question is just to think about how we can measure DEI, which I think is probably fairly clear to everyone in the audience that that's a challenging thing to do, and then to think about what firm characteristics and outcomes it's correlated with. And so, one of the great things about this paper that, if anything, I'm going to push them to try to exploit even more is this novel data that they were able to get from, what is it, Great Place, it's a mouthful, Great Place to Work's 100 Best Companies to Work For in America, these annual surveys, but kind of getting disaggregated information on all the questions that underlie that analysis, some of which happen to be related to these issues. All right, so key findings of this, I can go through this very quickly because we just saw a great presentation of this, but these scores have increased over time. They seem to be correlated with better performing, less financially constrained firms, higher among firms with more women in management, though not necessarily at the very highest levels. And then they're associated with better, unexpected, maybe accounting performance, but not so much when you look at stock returns, not so much when you look at innovation outcomes, although with the subtleties that Simon presented. So let me try to give some comments here, and I want to mostly focus kind of at a bigger picture, kind of overview level, and then have a few sort of more specific suggestions to offer. So actually, you had a much prettier version of basically this slide, but could have just used yours instead of mine. But the obvious place to start is how to define these concepts, because they are, not all of them are sort of so cut and dry. So diversity, bringing a range of perspectives, backgrounds into the organization. This has to do with different demographic characteristics. Come back to this in a second. Equity, inclusion. I won't read the definitions, but you can see this here. What I want to emphasize is sort of, if we were going to start from scratch and try to measure these things, and then try to sort of think about what they're correlated with or what outcomes they predict, how would you think about these three different components differently? So, if you start with diversity, and this is probably the reason why there's a pretty big literature, right, looking at demographic traits and a whole bunch of outcomes in this sort of literature. It's reasonable to proxy for this with observable demographic traits, right? I mean, that one seems relatively straightforward. We get to equity, it gets a little bit trickier. You think you probably, if you wanted to try to measure this in a very concrete, direct way, would need some internal information about what's going on inside firms that we don't normally have. And yet you could still probably proxy for this with some outcome-based proxies that are available, things like gender and racial gaps in pay and the like. So it seems like there's sort of some concrete things one could probably do on that dimension. When we get down to inclusion, this one seems sort of the most subjective in nature, and it's sort of hard to think about how we could really generate a proxy for this with sort of typically observable data. Maybe you could see things like, does the company have like suggestion boxes lying around? But I'm not really sure how I would do that. But it's also, this is going to be most also heavily intertwined with how individuals perceive what's going on in the company. Maybe less so than, certainly less so than, at the top level here, diversity, and probably more so than equity as well. Okay, so there are a lot of challenges here, but I think there's kind of an analogy to ESG here in some sense, where these things are kind of different from each other. Maybe D is like the G in some sense. And then we have E and I, and of course the E is different here than the E there. All right, so now let's think about what the paper is actually trying to do. So Simon also had a slide that was prettier that had this too. So these are the index components, the different questions that go into the index. And then what the authors do is to take an average. These are kind of 1 to 5 responses, and then average across all of the questions. So a couple things I would say here. So one, I would just drop this one. We can all think about whether our workplace is psychologically and emotionally healthy, but it's not obvious to me that that's so directly related to DEI. I mean, it could be related to lots of other things. But most of the other questions, I mean, there clearly is some element of this. What I would say, the paper kind of goes directly to constructing this index, which is a natural place to start. I would encourage you to spend more time on this part in sort of a disaggregated way and sort of tell us just more about how the questions relate to each other. Try to maybe look at some of the correlations on a question-by-question basis or grouping them in different ways. This doesn't point actually, but I mean, so there's some of these, things like managers avoid playing favorites. Management shows a sincere interest in me. There's sort of an element of managerial quality in here maybe, which is sort of different from DEI. And so it'd just be nice to kind of try to tease some of that stuff out. Now, the bigger point that I want to make is, again, if you look at these questions sort of holistically, it seems like they're mainly targeting inclusion and to some degree equity, but very few of these really are directly about diversity. And to me, that's actually a strength of the paper, because if you look at the existing literature, it's pretty much all about diversity and not very much about equity and inclusion, even if that's sort of pulled in the discussion of the paper. So, I would, I think, lean into this a little bit more, that what this paper is about is trying to take maybe the first serious step at really measuring E and I and actually distinguishing it from D, rather than having this index and then calling it DEI, right, which I think kind of obscures what the real contribution of the paper is. All right, so the rest of my time, I just want to talk about a few things. And I will say the paper is very well written in terms of recognizing the limitations of what it can and can't say. So they're not pitching this as we're going to show that DEI causes this or causes that, or this causes DEI or that. So I don't have anything to criticize, and I think it's very appropriately discussed. But I think there are, in addition to what's in the paper currently, a few challenges I would just like to see more discussion of. And I don't know in all cases that they're fully solvable, but just some things that I think would be good to discuss a bit more. So one is this issue of how employees are perceiving what's going on inside the firm relative to what the firm is actually providing. And those two things can be different, right? I mean, there's no guarantee that they line up with each other. And so, it could be that how employees perceive fairness inside the firm, I'm using fairness in sort of like a very not imprecise way, but how they perceive this is just a function of how things are going generally, right? So, when things are going well, like my 401k is growing and, I'm just generally happy, then I perceive the workplace to be, really inclusive and all of these other things. And so I think, it would be nice to be able to get at that a bit. I think you might be able to empirically, right? If you could do something like look at shocks to aggregate performance, right, that aren't necessarily idiosyncratic to the firm, but then see, how that's relating with your DEI metrics, that might help us tease that out a little bit. Now, there's also a different level of this, which is these perceptions, of course, even within a firm are in the eye of the beholder, right? So they can be different for different people. And where I worry about this a little bit is if we think about kind of like favored groups versus the disfavored groups, or sort of in-group, out-group. And so I know you can't. I mean, this is where it's like, if only you could see, this is Sean's response, and, this is Irene's response, and like then you could really kind of separate this out. But of course, you can't do that in the data, right, as far as I understand. But, I think maybe you could get at this a little bit in a couple of ways. One, I mean, you're focused entirely on the levels of the answers here, but I think you might be able to see something if you looked at like second moments instead of first moments, right? And see, is there a lot of dispersion in how the employees are perceiving these different factors inside the firm or not. So I would try to think about ways to exploit that. I also think, you could consider actually interactions of the, this is where kind of saying we're about maybe more E and I and not so much about D, but then you could think about interactions of the D with the E and I, right? And say, well, like conditional on having, a certain level of gender, say, or race or whatever diversity in the firm, how do things look different depending on the score that you have on the E and I dimensions? All right, so I don't have much more. I'm actually going to finish pretty much right on time. The last thing I wanted to mention is just, we know that workers and firms are part of a two-sided match, right? So there's a lot of papers in this. I just pulled one because it happens to be by one of my co-authors, but that, finds that young workers disproportionately match to young firms. Of course, they may perceive things like DEI differently from other workers. And so, this is where I feel like I'll end on this because I feel almost guilty saying it because I know you're going to be very limited in what you can do just based on the nature of the data. It would be really nice, though, to be able to look a little bit inside the firm and sort of think about how, what are the determinants of changes in these things over time. And again, I know this requires you to see the same firm being or applying for this status over multiple years. So, it's not going to be every firm. It's not a true panel. It's, of course, it's different workers that are responding to the survey, presumably every time it's given. So, there are challenges there. But I think the more you could tell us, the better. And even things like, how do DEI scores relate with entries and exits into this sort of sample of firms applying for best company to work for status would itself, I think, be really interesting to know. So I just, you've already done a ton of stuff, but I'm sort of suggesting, do even more. So, all right, so let me just end with, this is it's great novel data on what's obviously a very first order issue. There's so much discussion of this in the policy space, but often disconnected from much actual evidence. And so I think that this paper is potentially really important just in giving us a structured way of thinking about this and then telling us, what do we actually see in the data. And so again, this paper can really say something about these E&I dimensions that prior literature doesn't or can't do. And so, I think the authors are already doing a really good job of being careful about what they can say or not say. And so I just encourage, as you're revising, continue to do that, right? And the more you can sort of theoretically motivate the predictions and avoid this sort of ex post, this is how we kind of shoehorn this into a theory, the better the paper will continue to be. I really enjoyed reading it. Can't wait to see, what comes next. So that's it.
Thanks so much for the discussion. I liked it very much and thought that the comments were very helpful. Just on a few points, you mentioned earlier that when you think about DEI from the definition, one could start with some criteria, right? You could use these kind of criteria for equity or that kind of criteria for diversity. We think that because we measure it on survey or employee perceptions, this way we avoid choosing criteria that we can measure, right? If we were looking at some kind of hard criteria, we would have to choose criteria that we can measure, and we have to pick them somehow. And that's why we thought it's better to let the employees speak and survey their opinion of the company. Of course, this raises the very valid point that maybe employees they see the survey, but then their 401k goes up and they think, okay, the company is doing great, so I'm happy with everything what they do. And I really like the suggestion that we could look at some kind of shocks to performance in the company, and maybe then we see some kinds of change in the responses to figure out or to disentangle a bit the emotion versus the actual DEI responses. I like that suggestion very much, and also I like the idea of maybe the paper is more about equity and inclusion than about diversity. And we will definitely do more in terms of figuring out how do the individual questions fit together, because we got the comments that how did we pick these 13 questions that we have, we got this question a lot, so that's really critical for the index that we came up with, to understand better how do the questions fit to each other and and explore this a bit more. You said it would be nice to have the names or the actual answers of who is doing it. We don't have the names, but we have the demographics of these people. So that's definitely something we can look into. We know if it's a white male or if it's a female minority. So we can look more into this, and we will definitely do. I thank you very much. I would like to open it to the floor for questions. Yes.
So it seems like your sample is based on companies who applied for best companies to work. So there's a selection issue here. So I don't know how big your sample is. I see 2,000 firm years, so it's around a few hundred firms. So I guess the first question is, can we take the result, the findings, to more general, bigger sample? And the second question is, maybe employees will benefit from if the firm gets selected as the best company to work, right? Because there's more prestige, attract better talent. So maybe they will create a bias that these people, when they fill out the questionnaire, there will be a positive bias. So actually last year in this conference, it's a great conference, there's a paper I think that's very relevant by Tran Hao. So he actually used the also employee perspective from Glassdoor. So as it turns out, around 50% of the questions on the Glassdoor is actually related to ESG stuff. So I was just wondering, maybe you can cross-check with that data and to show that, okay, to learn whether there is a bias and whether, maybe your result also holds with this alternative data. Yeah.
So on your first question about the inclusion in the sample, so it's right that companies apply to become best company, and then that's only when they are surveyed. But the important thing is we do not only look at the companies that actually get best companies, we look at also the companies that applied but failed to become best company. So we have some kind of variation. I think it's fair to say that our sample probably includes like companies that think they are doing better in terms of DEI, right? I mean, you only apply if you think you have somehow of a chance. But still, we have enough variation to find some results, right? I mean, it would like shrink like the variation in the data if only the best apply. Still, we find some variation. So I think like the selection issue in terms of like who becomes a best company is not so much of an issue. But there is, of course, the concern like because we only like not every company is surveyed, right? I mean, there is some kind of like these companies are more larger, right? That get surveyed, and like no matter what if they make it to a best company or not. That's I think is a fair point, but yeah, we still have some variation in terms of the data. And we are aware of the paper that you mentioned, and that's something on our list, like to look more into like how does our measure correlate with like corporate culture measures, and then of course this measure makes a lot of sense to look at in Glassdoor data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily, for plugging for our conference. I remember that paper too. My question is actually related to Geoff's question. How much, and what I didn't see in the paper is how much within firm over time variation there is in the DEI index, and then could you actually exploit that difference in some of your tests? Because I mean, you control for, I think, for industry year fixed effect. I mean, would you discover anything more if you control for firm fixed effect and year fixed effect?
Yeah. So we have a lot of variation across firms, but not so much within firms. It tends to be more stable over time, and that's why also like firm fixed effects make no sense because there's very little variation within the firm. But then we also have this issue that Geoff mentioned that like companies like apply for like 3-4 years in the next years, and then they do not apply anymore if they don't make it into the best company. So we do not see like the same company, like very rarely see the same company being like surveyed over like 15 years. But yeah, that's something we tried. But there's like the variation comes more across firms within industry because we have the industry year fixed effects, but not so much over time in the same company. Yes, we have. I can bring it up.
Thanks a lot, very interesting. So just a quick maybe suggestion or idea, maybe you can take a look, and again, it comes from the literature on credit defaults or credit rating deteriorations as kind of a shock, potential shock, and the effect on DEI in those fields.
Yeah, as terms of a shock to like general performance of the company. Yeah, that's a nice idea. Yeah, thank you.
There is literature that connects between those deteriorations and the effect on the employees.
Yeah. Maybe it helps us to disentangle some kind of emotion response to like the company's just doing well now, and then we are happy with everything what they do. Yeah. We have more questions. Okay.
Thank you very much. So we're going to have a short break. Thank you very much.
Thanks.